are doing another shallow dive into some of the definitions and important things, I think, when it comes to discussing and understanding cultivated meat and generally the alternative protein space. And I want to start this one by talking about stem cells. So stem cells is a term you're likely to hear quite a lot as you're learning more and more about the industry, how it works. I think so. I think it's an important term to at least somewhat understand what is a stem cell and how does it relate to the production of cultivated meat. So hopefully you understand the concept of cells. If not, then I guess you're in a bit of trouble because it's kind of quite basic stuff. But I'm not saying I really fully understand everything about cells. I definitely don't. But what I do know is that our body and the bodies of animals are made up of millions and millions of cells. And cells are these tiny little structures that you cannot see, with your eyes, but with under a microscope, a cluster of these cells you can see, and you can see these cells, sorry, under a microscope, but a cluster of these cells is then what makes the body what it is. So we have millions of cells that make up a body, and there are hundreds, if not I think thousands, of different types of cells. And all of them have different characteristics, different roles, let's say, to play in order for the body or the organism that the cells are part of to function. Now, one of these types of cells, as I said, there's thousands of different types of cells. One of them is a stem cell. So it's a type of cell, and it's a very, very important cell. As I read about it and find out about it, because it's very powerful, I think. The reason that stem cells are powerful or important in my eyes is because they have these two key characteristics. So stem cells are able to essentially clone themselves, so replicate themselves. So they divide into a mother and a daughter cell, where the mother cell is basically another copy of itself, or maybe it's the daughter cell. Maybe I've confused that, but essentially the concept that I want you to grasp here is that a stem cell can basically multiply and make another copy of itself, which allows it to grow. And the other key aspect of a stem cell is its ability to kind of morph or turn into another type of cell. It can essentially help us replicate new types of cells that we need for the body. So these processes, I believe, one's called proliferation, which is the process of it cloning itself, and differentiation is the process of when a stem cell turns from it being a stem cell into like the cell that it wants to or needs to turn into to fulfill its role in the body, let's say. So going back to what I've just covered off, the stem cell is a type of cell, and the key characteristics of a stem cell are that it can clone itself, and it can turn into different types of cells. And when we consider a stem cell, there's three types of stem cells that exist. And here I'm just talking generally. I'm not specifically honing into cultivated meat. I'm just talking generally about stem cells. There's three types. So we have the embryonic stem cell. That's number one. And then we have number two, which is the adult stem cell. And then number three is the IP stem cell. So three different types of stem cells that we have. And what I want to do is go through each type very briefly and just give you a kind of idiot's definition of what that stem cell is, and also how it starts to relate to cultivated meat production. So first and foremost, the embryonic stem cell. Um, so this is probably the one that you've heard of the most, and probably as you can get from the name, the embryonic stem cell comes from the embryo. So this is what is basically the start of a baby, because it's found in the embryo of a female. Um, and the very, very powerful thing about these embryonic stem cells is they have the ability to turn into any cell. And that's why basically any cell you have in your body comes from the source is the embryonic stem cell, because it's basically differentiated. It's morphed into a skin cell, or it's morphed into something else. So it's a very, very important and powerful type of stem cell, but it's very, very well. I think it's not used at all actually in the cultivated meat sector. Um, there are obviously, I think, as you can guess, some ethical issues around the use of embryonic stem cells generally. So specifically in cultivated meat, you would be like using an early stage embryo to create meat. So it's not used from in cultivated meat, and also it's quite a hard thing to get hold of. In other areas of research, they're usually getting embryonic stem cells from IVF clinics, I think they're called, where they're not being used, or they're going to be discarded and they're taking them from them. So it's quite heavily regulated in terms of how you can use it. So you will hear, and you will probably heard a lot about embryonic stem cells, but generally in the space of cultivated meat, it doesn't seem that they're really being used specifically. So the next type of stem cell is an adult stem cell. So the adult stem cells are similar to the embryonic stem cells in that they can differentiate. They're found in the body, then they can differentiate and change into other other types of cells. But their ability to change is limited in terms of what type of cells they can change into. So I would sort of think of them as a little bit more specialized stem cells than the embryonic ones, where they're already kind of ready to replace certain cells within the body. So I think a relatable example would be adult skin stem cells, or perhaps adult blood stem cells. These stem cells are already ready in place to turn into skin cells or blood cells when you cut yourself, or just generally as you rub your finger and the skin replaces itself. So those cells are used in some cases by cultivated meat companies. But from my research, it really does look like this is the minority and not the majority of companies using this process. So what they're essentially doing is extracting a specific type of stem cell. So let's say a muscle stem cell from a cow, and then using that the cultivated meat process to make it turn into a muscle cell, essentially. But it's quite an invasive process, and it's quite involved, and it has limitations in terms of what the adult stem cells can actually change into. So generally speaking, they're not as commonly used in cultivated meat as the next type of cell, which is an IP stem cell. So you'll notice that I'm abbreviating IP because I can't pronounce or can't remember the full, I think it's induced pluripotency stem cells, something like that. I'll put it up on the video if you're watching a video here. But essentially, these are the third type of stem cells. And when reading into it and learning it, I kind of see these as sort of like man-made stem cells, or maybe better to call them mutated, man-adapted stem cells. So they don't naturally occur in the form that I'm referring to. They actually have some, let's say, tweaking that's done to them in order to give the stem cell properties. So let me try and explain what an IP stem cell is. Essentially, what it is a normal cell. So it could be like a skin cell or a blood cell, not a stem cell, a normal cell. It's extracted from the animal or what have you. And in a lab, scientists are doing some crazy fancy stuff to essentially make that normal cell revert back to a stem cell. I know it sounds pretty crazy, and it is pretty crazy, I think, when I listen to it and read about it. And essentially, when they do that process, that then creates a stem cell that not only has the ability to mutate and differentiate into back into a normal cell, but there's actually a wider range of types of cells that IP stem cell can now change into. And this is actually one of the key reasons why an IP stem cell seems to be used more frequently in the cultivated meat production process than an adult stem cell, because it has that ability to to basically change into a wider spectrum of cells. The other area or other reason why you're likely to find the use of IP stem cells as opposed to adult stem cells is something called the Hayflick limit. And I'll probably make a separate video or recording about that. But essentially, if you refer back to earlier, I mentioned about one of the criteria of a stem cell is its ability to like replicate itself. Proliferation, I think, is the term. But there's a limit to how many times that can occur. So eventually you would have to go out and get a new source cell, because it's replicated only a certain number of times. What's the benefit of an IP stem cell as opposed to an adult stem cell is generally it has a longer duration, a longer durability, essentially. So when companies are using these cells, if you're using an IP stem cell, I mean, there's some work that needs to be involved to extend it, but essentially there's a greater ability to reuse the stem cell rather than going out to get a new source. So those are the three types of stem cells that exist. And as I've said, usually when you're reading about cultivated meat, learning about the technology, you probably find that IP stem cells are the type of stem cells that are used, as opposed to the other two, adult stem cells or embryonic stem cells. Now, the next thing to understand in this topic is what actually is the stem cell used for? How does it go from being in an animal to actually, being used as part of the meat making process? In both cases, whether it's an animal stem cell that's used, an adult stem cell that's used, or an IP stem cell that's used, the source is the animal that the cultivated meat company is trying to create meat from. Okay. In the case of the use of an adult stem cell, they're basically doing a biopsy on the animal. So let's take a cow, for example. They're cutting into a cow. Usually it's still alive. And they're actually taking the adult stem cell directly from the animal. In the case of the IP stem cell process, still the same thing. They're going into the animal to cut a piece of it out, but in this case they're just taking a normal cell, they're not taking a stem cell. But in both cases, I think it's important to understand that they're still going to a live animal. With an IP stem cell, that is then in a lab altered, that normal cell that they've taken, to create the IP stem cell. So now in both cases, you've got a stem cell that has the ability to grow and also change. So the first step, once you've got that stem cell, is the proliferation stage. So the proliferation stage is where the scientists or the cultivated meat companies are basically controlling the conditions of the stem cell to make it replicate itself. So essentially that one stem cell, let's say, that they're using is then becoming two, and it's growing and growing and growing. So you've just got a greater mass of still stem cells. So still the cells that you actually want to, still stem cells. So they haven't got to the stage where they're actually got the type of cells you're wanting to consume. You're still just trying to increase the number, the mass of cells to create meat. So the second stage, once you've proliferated enough and you've got the cells to a volume or a mass that is enough to create the meat, is the second stage, which is the differentiation stage. So this is where the scientists and the cultivated meat companies, are controlling the conditions of this big mass of stem cells to trigger a process where those stem cells are then turning into the cells that we're actually interested in. So in the context of cultivated meat, the cells that we're actually interested in are basically the flesh of an animal. So most commonly, the cells are being turned into, these stem cells are being turned into muscle stem cells or fat stem cells. So there are then processes after that to actually start making this then mass of muscle cells or fat cells turn into the right kind of tissue structure for us to consume it. But I think in the context of understanding what a stem cell is, it's those first stages which is important. So it's extracting the cell, the source, from the primary cell from the animal, turning it into a stem cell if that's relevant, making it duplicate itself. Once it's duplicated itself, then making it turn from a stem cell into the cell of choice. So I hope that was not too confusing and easy to follow. And yeah, I'll wrap it up there.